My name is Diego Sanchez Albertea. I'm the head of the department, but I'm also fellow of the Latin American Center. So, like Francesca, I have parts of the communities that are here today. My job is only to make sure that people keep on time and to celebrate Francesca. So I will try to do only those two things. Let me say that how nice it is to actually be here to be doing this for 4 reasons. I normally always say 3, but the event is so important that I have a 4th. So the first is obviously that I think as we move to the new normal, it is really nice every time we can do a face-to-face event. And at least in my case, I just don't take it for granted anymore. So anytime I have so many faces, I'm just so pleased that much of what happened hopefully is over. But the main reason, the second, is actually to come to celebrate a fantastic book from a great researcher here, and also a book that is not only fantastic, as you will hear, but is very much a result of work done in Oxford. So this is work that Francesca designed, then started, then suffered. I don't know if you would say much about that, but suffered and then finished and celebrated while she was at Oxford. First as one of the Marie Curie's fellows from the European Union, and then of course, at the end, in the last phase, as both member of the Latin American Center and member of his department, which is the post she currently occupies. The third reason is that I actually love the fact that Francesca has given us the opportunity to bring my 2 communities in Oxford, her 2 communities in Oxford. So there's obviously a student from international development, the scholars from international development, but also from the Latin American Center. Sometimes we need to remind people that obviously Latin America is a very important region of the global South to think about in terms of the many of the challenges around human rights, the building states, and transnational issues, and therefore that these conversations between these 2 communities become extremely important. And finally, the 4th reason is that it allows me to share a table with 3 great speakers and discussants in addition to Francesca. Jose Alexander is my colleague at this department. She's professor of Commonwealth Studies and has done a very extensive work thinking at the social and political history of Southern Africa in general and Zimbabwe in particular. So we'll bring a very different and regional perspective to the one in Latin America. Let's say that from now on, I also sort of thankful to Josh because she will be the next head of the department, allow me to move to something else next year. Para Armstrong is with a PhD here, sorry, DPhil, later. The DPhil here, and is now Associate Professor of Human Rights in the Institute of the Americas, which is a sister institution to the Latin American Center in UCL. Works extensively in human rights and can bring that perspective.
Yeah, this is just some of the leftovers, so I thought maybe as well.
The last chair very much represents what happens when you organize an event between in Oxford. We actually went to the Latin American Center, planning to come here. It's not too far, so he will be here soon. Is Ezequiel González Ocantos. He is Associate Professor in the qualitative study of comparative political institutions in Nuffield College, and has also worked extensively on issues of governance, law. I know that has been someone that has supported Francesca as well. What we are going to do is have Francesca give a presentation on and then have each of the discussants talk for around 10 minutes to then have plenty of time for questions. So, I'm just giving you the voice, but congratulating you, Francesca, for this fantastic book.
Yes. Great to see so many of you actually running out of space. But it's great to be here and to take your time and be here today. I really appreciate it. Now I have the very hard task of presenting a book that, as you can see, is quite large and was the result of a 10-year research project in 15 minutes. So it's very difficult, but I'm gonna try and do my best. And in order to give a framing to the presentation that makes sense to you all, I decided to structure my presentation around one emblematic story of victims of Operation Condor in South America. Because by telling you the story of Anatole and Victoria, this allows me to actually discuss the two main themes that are at the heart of the book. And the two main themes are national repression and also transnational justice. So I will begin with the story of Anatole and Victoria. On December 22, 4-year-old Anatole and 19-month-old Victoria stepped out of a black car into O'Higgins Square in the port city of Valparaiso. You see on this slide some playground games, and this is a photo from more recently, but the games were still there in 1976. And this is where Anatole and Victoria spent most of the day on December 26. The owners of these games allowed the two brothers who were alone and holding hands to play for most of the day, thinking that at some point a member of their family would show up and pick them up. But the whole day passed and nobody appeared. And so by the evening, the owner of the rides called the Carabineros, Chile's military police, to report to them the two abandoned brothers. So who were these mysterious children who, according to the local newspaper El Mercurio, were well dressed and spoke with expressions that were typical of the River Plate, the river that divides Argentina and Uruguay? Anatole and Victoria's inexplicable appearance in Valparaiso occurred at a time of state terror all across South America. Since the mid-1950s, in fact, several military dictatorships that were inspired by the national security doctrine and that enjoyed US support in the context of the Cold War took power across the region, beginning in Paraguay in 1954, and then in a sort of snowball effect, we see military takeovers all across the region until Argentina, the last one, in March 1976. Despite differences between these regimes, what we can say is that all of them brutally repressed all forms of political and social opposition, whether these were peaceful or armed. Systematic human rights violations were perpetrated in the name of the fight against communism at this time, and these resulted in thousands of abductions, disappearances, cases of torture, sexual violence, and also the stealing of babies and toddlers. All of these crimes were committed both inside the borders of states, but also beyond borders. Anatole and Victoria were the children of Mario Julien and Victoria Grisonas that you can see on the slide. They had fled political repression in their native Uruguay and the persecution by the military dictatorship. Mario left first in 1973 and sought refuge with the UNHRC in Argentina. And once he secured that, his family followed him. And so in May 1975, little Victoria was born in Buenos Aires. The family lived on the outskirts of the Argentine capital, and Mario and Victoria were active in the local Uruguayan exile community in Argentina. They in fact belonged to the Party for the Victory of the People, also known as PVP. And this party had been founded in Buenos Aires by a group of Uruguayan political exiles in July 1975. And their objective was to try and catalyze the resistance against Uruguayan dictatorship from Argentina. In the context of several operations in 1976 against militants that belonged to the PVP, in September 1976, the family house of the Julian family was attacked by a joint military operation with the participation of both Uruguayan and Argentine police and military officers. Mario was killed on the spot, and Victoria and her two children were taken to a secret clandestine detention center that you can see on the slide, which was known as Automotores Orletti in one of Buenos Aires neighborhoods. In this center, in fact, throughout 1976, several hundred foreigners and political refugees had been illegally held in the context of in the framework of Operation Condor. They're spending about 10 days detained in Orletti alongside their mother and other Uruguayan prisoners. Others were taken on a flight to a second country, to Uruguay. And there they were held in the building that you see at the top of the slide, which is a building in central Mexico that at the time housed the military intelligence service. In the basement of that building, there was a secret detention center where many political prisoners were held. But Anatole and Victoria, being children, they were held on the ground floor, and they were looked after by Maria Claudia Garcia, that you can see also on the slide, an 8-month-old pregnant Argentine woman who had also been taken with the two toddlers from Argentina to Uruguay. And she looked after them for a couple of months until she herself gave birth to her daughter, Macarena, at the beginning of December. In December 1976, so 3 months after the initial operation in Buenos Aires, the two brothers were taken on a flight to Chile. This was the third leg of their ordeal. And when I interviewed Anatole in 2013, he told me that he doesn't have many memories of those times, but he actually remembers very clearly being on a small plane and actually seeing the Andes from the window, because he had never seen mountains before in his life. But how could the two brothers endure such an ordeal that encompassed 3 different countries over 3 months? The crimes that Anatole and Victoria suffered were the result of the so-called Operation Condor, a secret network that was set up by the regimes of Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay in late 1975, so that they could coordinate better their policies of repression and actually be able to carry out operations in each other's territories, so they could reach all the political exiles who had escaped from their countries of origin. As you can also see on the slide, Operation Condor grew over time from the 5 founding members in 1975 to include Brazil in 1976, and also Ecuador and Peru in 1978. So by the late 1970s, Operation Condor effectively had created a borderless area of terror and impunity all across South America. Operation Condor was a sophisticated and ambitious scheme that these military regimes put in place to effectively amplify their policies of repression and to ensure that geographical borders of states were no longer an obstacle to the repression of any form of political opposition. And there were four key elements to Operation Condor. The first one is Condor Trials, which was a communication system that enabled Condor member states to quickly exchange information about targets that they were trying to detain, or when they arrested somebody, they could quickly notify the country of origin that the person had in fact been apprehended. The second element is Condor Eje, which refers to effectively an operations office that was physically located in Buenos Aires, and in which members of the police and military forces from other countries beyond Argentina were permanently stationed so that they could take part in operations. And it's not surprising that this office was located in Argentina, because by the mid and late 1970s, Argentina was the country where the largest number of exiles had sought refuge. And once there was the coup in Argentina in March 1976, the refugees were effectively cornered with nowhere else to flee. The third element is a data bank and information center, which basically centralize the intelligence information of the different Condor member countries in one location that could be quickly accessed by all the members and shared quickly through the Condor telecommunication system. And finally, the fourth element is the top secret Teseo unit, which we actually found out about 3 years ago with the latest round of declassification of US government documents. And this unit was basically composed of agents from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, who undertook operations to eliminate exiles in Europe, especially in France, but there were also attempted operations in the UK, Spain, and Portugal. Returning to Anatole and Victoria, after spending time in various orphanages in Valparaiso, they were eventually adopted by the Larabeiti Yanez family. In 1979, thanks to a tip-off from the large exile community in South America, their paternal grandmother, Maria Angelica, who had been looking for them since the family's disappearance 3 years earlier, was finally able to be reunited with them in Valparaiso. Alongside the adoptive family, they decided that the best solution at the time was for the two brothers to remain in Chile, in Valparaiso, with their adoptive family, following advice from psychologists, because it would have been devastating, especially for Anatole, who still remembered losing his first family to actually lose a second family he had been living with. And so the agreement was that the two brothers would stay in Valparaiso as long as they would visit Uruguay regularly, so that they could get to know their biological family as well. But many questions still remained unanswered despite this unification. Why had the toddlers been taken from Argentina to Uruguay and then to from Uruguay to Chile? Were they some kind of war victim? And finally, what had been the destiny of their parents who are still disappeared? In the second part of the book, I then retrace the efforts by a large cohort of activists and justice seekers to try and bring to light some of the answers regarding the crimes that had been committed during the context of Operation Condor. And so in the book, I put forward the notion of justice seekers to identify all those individuals, most frequently survivors, families, relatives of victims, civil society activists, but also lawyers, politicians, judges, and prosecutors who dedicate their efforts to try and bring to light some of the atrocities that have been committed, and also make sure that justice is delivered. And as they became older, Anatole and Victoria themselves turned into justice seekers, because they followed in the efforts of many other activists and family members in trying to denounce the crimes of Operation Condor, but also to try and bring to justice the individual responsible. And in the second part of the book, I show how justice seekers initially faced a context of almost absolute impunity, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, because despite the return of democracy to South America, we still have the enactment of several amnesty laws that effectively blocked the investigation of these crimes. And so in the book, I highlight different strategic litigation pathways that these justice seekers undertook, whether it was by trying to file cases in South America itself or using the tribunals of some European countries to try and push for justice. And overall, there have been at least 47 criminal cases that have been specifically focusing on Operation Condor. And so far, there have been at least 30 verdicts in criminal trials. And there are 4 trials going on at this time, with several cases still at the pre-trial phase. And looking at the countries which conducted these investigations, we can see how Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay themselves have led the largest number of criminal cases, also showing how the efforts of justice seekers were eventually successful over time, because they were able to effectively remove the obstacles of amnesty laws and impunity. And finally, we return full circle to Anatole and Victoria, who never gave up their search for truth and justice. After an uphill struggle in 2020, an Argentine federal court sentenced 4 intelligence officers for a number of crimes against humanity, including for the first time their own abduction and the concealment of their identity. In December 2021, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights also condemned Argentina for its responsibility in the enforced disappearance of Anatole and Victoria's parents, and also because Argentina had violated the rights of the 2 brothers to know the truth about the fate of their parents. And I'm just gonna close here with the news, which is very important to me, that today the Spanish version of the book was also released in Uruguay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for a great presentation linking a story to the argument. Congratulations now also for the Spanish. Felicidades. Ezequiel, welcome. Don't worry. We expected someone to work. So let me now start with you, George, if that's okay. With your comments on that. Yes.
I'm really very deeply honored to be able to speak at the launch of the Condor Trials, Francesca Leska's extraordinary new book on transnational repression and transnational justice in South America. I finished reading the book yesterday, and I've been sitting kind of comfortably because it's very difficult material with it since, and I'm sure I've not yet. I also know my fellow speakers here are far more expert than I am, so my reactions are going to be brief and probably quite superficial, but I'll do my best. Okay, so I'm just going to make 3 points. The first is really to acknowledge and to celebrate the research itself. I have a very keen sense of Francesca's accomplishment in this regard, because I've been working on or struggling with transnational history for some years now. And I appreciate how hard it is to do what this book does. That is to piece together a complex human story that crosses multiple political and geographical boundaries, contends with multiple changing regimes, institutions, and political and military movements. It draws on disparate disciplines and their conceptual and methodological apparatuses. And it makes use of diverse sources, including interviews, archives, legal documents, and observation. This is a huge logistical challenge and a daunting intellectual challenge, as well as being emotionally difficult owing to the subject matter, which shouldn't be downplayed as an aspect of this kind of work. It is, in addition, extremely hard to do justice to the complexity of transnational history, while also keeping the story accessible and clear. The nature of this challenge is signaled at the start and the end of the book. It begins with 4 pages of acronym, and it closes with some 80 pages of tightly packed notes. In between, there is, however, a lucidly told story. This is my second point, the skill of the narrative construction of this book. It's divided into 2 big parts, and Francesca has given us a very nice idea of that already. These offer very different but closely intertwined narrative arcs. The first is a 5-part story of repression, couched as a rise and fall. State repression and its coordination across the cone of South America is given a history, extending beyond the most intense period of Operation Condor itself, which was just a 2-year, 1976 to 1978 period, to show its roots in earlier phases of cross-border police collaboration and its demise in bickering and dissension, but not till after it had largely achieved its political aim. At its most banal, this is a story of interstate institution building and information sharing, justified in familiar Cold War terms. But within it, a much more complex set of agendas and the messy actual operations of actors are meticulously picked apart and given a history. The second narrative arc concerns the search for recourse by state and non-state actors in and outside South America, actors whom Francesca calls justice seekers. This is a revelatory story about how the transnational network of repression described in the first part of the book was slowly revealed, and how some of its agents were ultimately held accountable. It is also, of course, another story of transnational networks. These begin humbly and under exceedingly dangerous conditions, and their work is not done even now, well over 4 decades later. It's not a linear or a neat story, and it goes on for far too long to be considered transitional. As Francesca emphasizes, there are many setbacks and reversals, and justice remains elusive for far too many. But at the same time, her account offers hope and inspiration. It details intermittent successes, some of them surprising and fortuitous, taking advantage of sympathetic state officials and brief political openings, and others which are won through literally decades of endurance and persistence, relying on both the fortitude of families of victims and the legal creativity and moments of humanity on the part of lawyers and judges. And there's a phrase that we use in the book, we were citing utopian lawyering, which I think gets at some of that fortitude required to carry on. The law in this book becomes something into which and through which life can be breathed, perhaps most strikingly through the legal category of the permanent crime of disappearance, which proved a crucial route to evading statutes of limitations and amnesty laws. This part of the book also underlines, in a kind of parallel and echo of Francesca's own research, the multidisciplinary, multi-source, transnational engines of research that the courts themselves became in this process. And those are the 2 grand narratives of the book. There are many smaller ones, and actually you started the presentation now. And that's where Francesca doesn't let us forget that we're talking about people's lives in all aspects of the story. Her chapters often start with a vignette that allows us to see both how repression worked and how it reverberated through the lives of people who were its victims, through the political movements of which they were a part, through families, through communities of exiles. These are striking stories of how the spread of military dictatorships and their increasing collaboration forced civilian and military opponents into exile again and again until there was nowhere to go, and they were hunted down, predominantly in Argentina, leaving a dispersed penumbra of political allies and family members with the terrible task of trying to ascertain their fates. Actors on all sides of these processes are named, and we learn details of their lives. There's specificity, in the descriptions of places, of objects, of particular moments, of accents, of languages, that feels attuned at one level to the demands of the courtroom, but which also has the effect of lending these accounts an intimacy, a kind of gritty, pedestrian, domestic quality that has a powerful effect beyond the evidentiary. An object like a recognizable piece of clothing, a jacket, or a shoe holds the potential of proving someone's presence in a site of detention, but it also acts as a powerfully intimate marker of the loved one's life. Telling these stories restores personhood to victims. My third point is a very brief one, and that is to touch on the themes this book ends on, which is the lessons of this history and the practices of the Condor Trials themselves, for understanding other places and times, for the present and the past, and for taking action. I was struck as a historian of Southern Africa by parallels as well as differences. Southern Africa's liberation struggles against minority and colonial rule were contemporaneous with Operation Condor and the political movement targeted. There were direct links in terms, for example, of the origins of counterinsurgency doctrines, the huge, but of course very complex influence of the Cold War, and the role specifically of Cuba as both inspiration and source of substantial support. Links were made across liberation movements, across this whole region, while the states they fought collaborated closely at different moments. I think it would be really productive to revisit and think comparatively about these kinds of Southern African transnationalism using Francesca's work. There are also, of course, echoes on the justice-seeking side, which many people have written about. I will try to revisit them here. But let me end on a bit of a personal note by mentioning that the area where I've worked for many years in Zimbabwe has benefited directly from the experience and the purpose of justice seekers in Argentina, specifically from the work of forensic anthropologists engaged in the exhumation of mass graves. Zimbabwe now has one of the best trained forensic anthropology teams on the continent, the product of the transnational networks that Francesca documents, which now feed into other different struggles for justice, ones that have also been forced to bide their time for decades, and whose lingering effects have spread across generations. For them, the story of the Condor Trials is unambiguously one of hope, and for that, we have to thank Francesca.
For the 10 minutes exactly.
Well, thanks for the invitation for to read the book. I'm familiar with Francesca's work, early work on Condor. I've been anticipating this book, and I can assure you that it doesn't disappoint. So get your own copy. Now, it's already been said, but this book is the result of really very impressive research that we conducted over many years. And the book is paradoxically both an easy and accessible read, but also deeply heart-wrenching. So the story that Francesca told now about the two siblings, she opens the book, and I had to put the book down for quite a while before I was able to kind of try to process this. As being a father, kind of it's a problem. So it is a difficult book. And Francesca has spent years researching Condor and the people whose life has been devastated by it. And this has not been an easy process, and it's already been said. I think this needs to be recognized because this is something that, as researchers often take for granted, that is something that we have to kind of go through with. But it's difficult at many different levels. So Francesca should be praised for and celebrated for that work that brings this to the public. So Francesca's personal commitment to the book and the research that underpins it is kind of an important contribution in its own right. As already been said, there are two main bits to the book. First is a forensic analysis of patterns of, let's say, oppression by the effective system of transnational repression in Bolivia, South America. And the second part of the book, I'd say, provides a kind of really detailed insight into how transitional justice or transnational justice have been unfolding, particularly since the end of the military regime. And one of Francesca's main claims, or major claims in the book, is that these are both transnational dynamics that are generally being overlooked by more state-centric approaches that tend to dominate the field of transitional justice. Now, I would like to make some brief comments and raise a few questions on the first part of the book, transnational repression. That is not really my field, I'm not a historian. But also I will try to focus most of my attention there for more familiar transition of transnational justice side. So Francesca's broader argument here about the lens of Condor as a specific understanding of Condor methods of state violence strongly resonates with me for two reasons. First, as already been said, the book provides what I find very intuitive and appealing kind of sense of the historically continuous perspective of patterns of transnational repression. So Condor did not come from nowhere. It was not just created on a day and disappeared on another. There's no kind of clear starting date or clear end date as such. And I think this is important because of how we can think of the many legacies of Condor that remain with us even today. And the second quick point to highlight is that the book emphasized the agency of South American military regimes in the system of transnational repression. So there's no kind of attempt to pin blame on the US for violence or Condor violence in the region from this period. So in contrast to much of the previous literature on Condor, that again I'm familiar with just by reading it, that literature largely focused on the role of the US, but the book plays far closer attention to the local network of dynamics of actors in South America. And I'm very sympathetic to this reading, but it would, I think, still be interesting to get a better understanding of the evolving attitudes in the US towards Condor as more information comes out, particularly the extent to which there were any notable shifts during periods of book. There's some illusion, indications in the book that things were happening on that front during the 20 years, but I'll leave that to the historians to talk about. So let me now turn to the main part for me of the book. That is the focus on transnational justice efforts. And here the analysis is so rich and detailed of the cases that have driven transnational transition justice efforts over several decades covered in the book. So a few points stand out. So the book really captures the energies and commitment of the multitude of actors that have pushed transnational justice efforts forward, often at great personal cost. These are what Francesca called the justice seekers. And it is precisely the demands and efforts of these justice seekers, their sheer persistence and the justice claims that have constituted the field of transitional justice in the countries covered in the book. It is in this sense that the book contributes to our understanding of transitional justice as a particular form of political practice. And what is more, I think it is a particular form of political practice that, while persistence, is also highly unpredictable and contingent. So to put this point differently, when we look at individuals and specific groups and their demands for justice, transitional justice as a political practice appears very powerful. It's a very powerful individual with very powerful demands. At the same time, when we take a few steps back, transitional justice as a political practice is also very fragile and prone to diversities. And this raises a few questions for Francesca, perhaps, for us to think about. So one concerns the evolution of transitional justice claims. So Francesca shows in the book that justice-seeking efforts started immediately at the time of repression. This is quite powerful. So mobilization at very high risk. Yet justice demands have clearly evolved over time, from practical truth-seeking, what happened, to humanitarian demands, bring them back alive, to general political accountability demands, the military as an institution should be held to account, to individual criminal accountability. So these are specific types of demands, or justice demands, and they shape in many ways They shape the ways in which justice seekers pursue justice, the tactics and the strategies they use, the venues they turn to, home, abroad, political, criminal venues. And it also shapes how we might think about effects or the impact of these demands, right? Which can be met, how have they been met? So to what extent, Francesca, do you think that these dynamics play out in the cases that you will follow with such a kind of evolution of demands over time? The second question concerns the creative litigation strategies that Francesca maps out in the book. So the main actors are family members, human rights lawyers, and activists, as well as prosecutors and individual judges. Not the judiciary as institutions, but individual judges. So in addition to the legal and institutional struggles they're engaged with, what about the political? In other words, what about the politics of litigation and the broader struggles play out? I will come back to this point, but perhaps most obvious here is that individual justice seeking is clearly important. So is democracy. However, and this leads me to kind of a third and final question concerning Condor trials themselves and what the book tells us about the law and the use of the law, both domestically and transnationally. Now, the book tells us something important about resilience and adaptability of human rights law and the politics that drive such processes. The book highlights the creative use of notions, for example, of an extraterritorial applicability of human rights provisions by justice seekers. Yet the practical obstacles here are just formidable in investigating, prosecuting, obtaining accountability for transnational crimes. And the book is really great in showing with extensive detail the kind of practical intricacies of human rights trials, the many hurdles encountered along the way, and the different methods, tactics, and strategies used by justice seekers. And yet, there's nothing triumphalist in this book. All right. You don't come away and say, no world is possible. So, okay. And Francesca shows here that nothing of this is inevitable. There's no necessary justice cascade going on here. There are no platitudes in this book about the arc of the moral universe is long and bending towards justice. Okay. Still, it would be negligent on my part, right, to kind of not at least raise some final questions about the criminalization of human rights that are kind of defining the transition justice efforts in this book. As many of you know, there are many strands to the critiques of criminalization of people as a way to pursue transition justice. First, criminal justice is a kind of individualized and decontextualized form of justice in the country. For others, transition justice, actually one, criminalized transition justice tend to favor punitive forms of justice and accountability. And here, there are inherent limitations of criminal justice, especially in response to the type of large-scale organized political violence that is at the center of this book. So the prosecution of individual cases might be symbolically significant, but focus on a handful of cases may invite accusations of selectivity. And it also far from clear that criminal prosecutions lead to any kind of discernible increase in quality of memorialization of society's past. So the question here, the critique, right, is for many, is that criminalized form of transition justice kind of narrows the conceptions of harm and remedies that may ensue. And this is particularly, I think, important to think about because at the end of the day, the kind of political struggles that are at the core of these human rights violations were struggles for more just societies, right? So if we put this differently, I'll conclude with this. Now, the justice struggles depicted in Francesca's book are unambiguously just. Right? But I think it remains crucial for us to remember that there were more ambitious justice visions that motivated the political struggles at the origins of this book. And again, thanks, Francesca. I enjoyed it and I was deeply moved by the book. Congratulations.
On time.
Thank you, and apologies once again for being late. The inertia took me to that. I need to think before acting. Okay, so as you know, Francesca is one of the leading voices of transitional justice research in Latin America. And her work is always compulsory reading for anyone who's interested in knowing about this topic in research. And this book is obviously an exception. Most studies of transitional justice take the individual trajectories of specific countries as independent from each other. And this book doesn't, and I think that is the key innovation, or one of the innovations. And I think this book will be highly influential precisely because it explores the overlooked the transnational dimension of both state repression and also the efforts to address the crimes perpetrated during the 1960s and 70s. In other words, in order to understand the complexity of the effort to bring the perpetrators to justice, we also need to understand the complexity of the crimes they perpetrated. And that complexity, at the heart of that complexity, is the transnational nature of that force. So Francesca traces the ways in which these Southern Cone dictatorships coordinated surveillance efforts, torture, the forced disappearance of activists before, during, and after the Condor years. This is already interesting because we often think of Condor as the maximum expression of this of state repression in these years. It was, but it was not an isolated episode. It had a history. It had a, and so the book contextualizes it within a longer arc of repression. But as I was saying earlier, it turns out it's critical to do this in order to understand the many ways in which victims, lawyers, judicial actors had to sort of innovate, but also cooperate across borders to denounce, to investigate, and to prove these crimes. So in the same way that the perpetrators cooperated, so did the justice seekers. And so in many ways, part one and part two of the book are sort of mirror images. The book combines, as it was mentioned earlier, impressive multinational, multi-archival numerous interviews with a variety of actors. Francesca also created new original databases to retrace the steps of both the perpetrators and the justice seekers. I think this empirical effort reflects the protracted, the multifaceted, interdisciplinary nature of transitional justice. So in part one of the book, where Francesca reconstructs the Condor system, would not have been possible in many ways without the information that emerged from waves of declassification, from truth commissions, from judicial processes in many countries. But what is truly fascinating about this book is that Francesca's own effort to tell the story of Condor fed back into these ongoing efforts to punish the crimes perpetrated by Latin American dictatorships, both in Latin America and Europe. So it took a talented researcher like her to put together all of this information coming from these various sources and to find new information herself in order to sort of connect the dots and understand the magnitude, the complexity of what happened. And her efforts actually proved crucial for victims and for justice seekers, for prosecutors struggling to prove these crimes in court. So in many ways, this is a book about transitional justice, but it is also an instance of transitional justice via the academy. And I think that is perhaps the most important achievement here. It's not a surprise that Francesca has won the award for the impact that this book has had. Now, the implications of this research are many, but I just want to focus on one that is related to the first part of the book, the part where Francesca reconstructs the Condor system. And I think this book needs to be read by scholars, not just of transitional justice of Latin America, but also those interested in various forms of macro criminality that transcends national borders, drug trafficking, human trafficking. It will teach us a lot of lessons about how those crimes can be persecuted and justice. But I also think it's a book that needs to be studied very closely by those interested in how autocracies operate. This is, to me, as I said, the most interesting aspect of the book. We often think of international cooperation through a liberal lens, as trade, as human rights treaties, things we like. But it should not come as a surprise that autocrats, authoritarian leaders of various stripes, also seek to forge transnational partnerships to cement their power, to project their power. Joe Biden recently called for a summit of democracies. And the reason he did that was he was trying to draw attention among sort of like-minded Western allies of the threat posed by the rise of what Anne Applebaum calls the global autocratic alliance. Now, this is not an ideological or a formal political alliance or political project, but it's a series of very loose, informal arrangements between autocrats from Europe, Latin America, and these ties are designed to protect these incumbents from both domestic and external threats. They are deals to circumvent Western sanctions, deals to guarantee personal enrichment and protect the foundations of kleptocracy, deals to quash domestic opposition, deals to spread misinformation. And Francesca's effort to sort of amass enormous amounts of data about one historical instance of autocratic or authoritarian cooperation can actually shed light on what determines the success of these ventures, but also what might anticipate their downfall and their failure. So as a result, I'm interested in understanding, but also in trying to undermine this global autocratic alliance should actually read the book and learn a thing or two. So I think Francesca highlights three factors that explain the rise of the Condor system, which sort of represented the highest point of authoritarian cooperation between these Southern Cone dictatorships. One of them is paranoia. So authoritarian regimes are notorious for the high levels of paranoia. Kurt Wayland has this wonderful book called Revolution and Reaction, in which he tries to explain the wave of autocratization in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, and he explains it as a product of elite fear to the Cuban Revolution. They feared that the Cuban Revolution would spread to their own countries. And he argues that perhaps these elites let too much into what happened in Cuba and, and thought wrongly that the conditions were right for this to happen elsewhere too. But the reaction to this fear, to this paranoia, was quite brutal, as we all know. Now, interestingly, because paranoia is often a defining feature of authoritarian rule, so is a lack of trust. So it's very hard in principle for these regimes to collaborate and cooperate with each other because they're inherently distrustful. But as Francesca shows in the book, sometimes fear wins, right? And they would overcome this fundamental structural lack of trust between these regimes to cooperate in order to get rid of what they perceived as the key threat. So in the case of Condor, the perceived threat from the armed left was stronger than this lack of trust, and this led to ever closer forms of cooperation during the 1970s. The second factor that helps us understand why these autocracies cooperate is obviously the political context, right? These things are in many ways contingent. So in the rise in the number of dictatorships was, of course, crucial for the success of Condor for two reasons. One quite obvious, which is that, the more autocracies there were in the region, the more candidates you could find to join the operation. But less obvious is the fact that these political changes had sort of indirect consequences that exacerbated this paranoia threat that drove the operation in the first place. And it led these leaders of these autocracies to realize that, or to think that the only solution to this perceived threat was a transnational solution. And that is the fact that as autocracies gained ground in the region, militants had to flee their countries of origin to seek safe haven in neighboring countries, occasionally in countries in other continents. But this sort of spread of the militant left, of the exiled left, was eventually led to Condor. They realized that was the way that they could sort of deal with this perceived threat. Cooperation was a solution to a common problem. And the third and final factor is this idea that there is a great degree of learning in processes of authoritarian cooperation. So, for example, Francesca shows how military and intelligence officers were gradually brought in, replacing the police who had originally been the actors in the repressive infrastructure. And in this way, they perfected surveillance and information sharing methods, but also other forms of learning, for example, by copying many of the structures of Interpol to pursue repression. What is interesting is that the book tells us or gives us some clues about why is it that autocracies cooperate, despite this inherent lack of trust, but it also shows how fragile the foundations of authoritarian cooperation. First of all, these are always, or at least in this case, but I suspect this travels to other cases, they're motivated by very, very short-term goals. So once transnational repression succeeded in a way in eliminating or quashing the threat, Condor was dismantled. Very sort of functionalist understanding of cooperation. The second is that it's actually very hard for these autocracies to build trust, no matter how much they perceive that they've got common interests and threats. So, you know, once at some point power disparities between these countries, you know, brought problems into these corporate venture. You know, Brazil was never fully convinced, it joined, but then it quickly left. And at some point, the Argentines and the Chileans could no longer work together. They started, you know, quarreling over territorial disputes that became more important than the common interest in repression. And finally, authoritarian cooperation needs patrons, but these patrons are hard to keep on your side. Authoritarian repression in particular is prone to getting out of hand. This can lead to all sorts of PR nightmares for the actors involved, in particular for the patrons. The assassination of Letelier in Chile in Washington is the case in point. This sort of triggered alarm bells among the American establishment and strong for at least a condemnation of Condor and eventually the demise of the operation because this patron. In other words, I just wanted to point this out because I think the book is rich in insights that can help us think about a crucial challenge of our time, which is how to deal with this autocratic global alliance. And in that regard, I think it's worth a read. There are many reasons why it is worth a read, but I thought I would highlight this. Thank you.